Clockwork Orange, released in 1971, became one of Stanley Kubrick's most seminal works essentially overnight, particularly due to its unique ability to set his films apart as Kubrickian. While the consensus acknowledges that the film was adapted from Anthony Burgess's 1962 magnum opus of the same name, far fewer people have actually read the novella itself. This is asserted by the 1971 film setting itself apart as the undisputed leading medium, with a gross of $114 million. And over time, the moving picture has evolved into a beloved cult classic. With these factors in mind, one can begin to ponder the differences between the two models and what makes the latter so much more popular and accessible to consumers. When considering Kubrick's cult classic and Burgess's cornerstone framework, it is no surprise how one soared over the other, whether it be through major narrative differences, diction, dialect, and most importantly, the endings that each artist draws, that is, maturity versus preservation. Today, we will be discussing the conflict of conclusions of A Clockwork Orange. The film, in my opinion, begins with one of the most iconic opening sequences in the history of cinema, introducing viewers to Alex DeLarge and his three droogs. Even in its first shot, the film begins to distance itself from the novel, with Alex clearly being a precocious 15 at the beginning of the novella, while 17 at the genesis of the film. Once again, viewers are acclimated to more anomalies, precisely the attire of the four goons. Burgess's book illustrates Alex and friends at the height of fashion, donning tight black clothing, protective crotch pieces, built-up shoulders, and decorative flourishes. Compared to the film, Kubrick constructs the four in white clothes, suspenders, boots, bowler hats, codpieces, canes, and Alex's single false eyelash, further distancing Kubrick's Alex from his young age into a full aesthetic of his sadistic decadence. Once more, we are invited to reference each medium through the initial narration and, more specifically, Alex's Nadsat dialect. Generally speaking, Alex and the Droogs' dialect is faithfully adapted for the screen, with an array of lines explicitly extracted from Burgess's novel. Such examples include phrases like "a bit of pain in the Gulliver," "real horror show," "Droogs," and other fragments of Alex's strange adolescent vocabulary.
Bit of a pain in the Gulliver, Mom. Good, real horror show.
And my three droogs.
However, Nadsat is not merely an aesthetic gimmick or a quirky futuristic mode of speech. As Mahmoud Kayalti argues in his article, The Deconstruction of Language in Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, a postmodern analysis, Nadsat functions as a form of linguistic deconstruction. It challenges conventional communication by creating a language that is recognizable enough to be followed, yet foreign enough to constantly destabilize the reader's understanding. In other words, Burgess does not completely abandon English. Rather, he corrupts, fractures, and reshapes it through Russian vocabulary, Cockney influence, adolescent slang, and criminal argot. This is significant because Nadsat does two things at once. For Alex, Pete, Georgie, and Dim, it creates community. It is their private language, their internal code, and one of the chief ways they separate themselves from the adult world. It reinforces their identity as outsiders and allows them to speak as if they were to belong to a world of their own making. But for the reader, and to a lesser extent the viewer, Nadsat creates a sense of alienation. One can understand the basic direction of the sentence, but not always the precise meaning. The audience is therefore forced to participate in the decoding of Alex's world. This becomes especially important when considering violence. Burgess's language often softens brutality by hiding it beneath playful or childish diction. A beating becomes a Tolchak. A head becomes a Gulliver. Friends become Droogs. Evil is not described in plain moral terms, but filtered through a language that makes cruelty sound musical, adolescent, and almost unserious. This is where the dialect becomes morally disturbing. The reader is gradually trained to understand Alex's language and, in doing so, becomes disturbingly acclimated to the violence it describes. Kubrick's film, of course, has to make concessions to screen time and audience comprehension. Because of this, the film simplifies a considerable amount of the slang Burgess employs throughout the novel. The book fully immerses us in Nadsat, while the film preserves enough of it to maintain Alex's linguistic identity without making the film inaccessible. Still, without reading the novel before watching, it can be quite arduous to fully comprehend the cornucopia of comments that Alex, Pete, Georgie, and Dim make in their classic speech. Ultimately, the difference between the novel and film lies in immersion. Burgess traps the reader inside Alex's language, making NADSAT the varied lens through which violence, pleasure, rebellion, and identity are processed. Kubrick, by contrast, uses NADSAT more selectively, pairing it with image, performance, costume, and music to create Alex's cinematic identity. In the novel, Alex's dialect reveals his precocious adolescent mind. In the film, that same dialect becomes one element in a broader aesthetic of stylized preservation. Another crucial distinction between the novel and film lies in the role of classical music, particularly Alex's adoration for Ludwig van Beethoven. In Burgess's novel, Alex's love of classical music operates as one of his great contradictions. He is sadistic, predatory, and morally grotesque, yet he is not entirely devoid of aesthetic sensitivity. His love for Beethoven suggests that some region of beauty still remains available to him, even if that beauty is constantly fused with violent fantasy. This makes Alex more disturbing, not less, because it disproves the comforting notion that art necessarily civilizes the soul. Kubrick, however, transforms music from an interior feature of Alex's character into one of the film's dominant cinematic weapons. Classical music does not merely accompany the violence, it choreographs it. Rossini, Purcell, and Beethoven turn brutality into spectacle, granting the ultraviolence a balletic, almost operatic, quality. This is where Kubrick's vision becomes uniquely unsettling. The audience is not simply watching violence, it is invited to experience violence's rhythm, composition, and aesthetic pleasure. The film use of Wendy Carlos's electronic arrangements deepen this effect. Classical music, traditionally associated with refinement, order, and high culture, is filtered through a futuristic and mechanical landscape. In this sense, even the score becomes clockwork, something organic and human made artificial, stylized, and machine-like. Burgess uses Beethoven to show that Alex still has access to beauty. Kubrick uses Beethoven to show how beauty itself can be absorbed into spectacle, violence, and institutional control. This becomes most explicit during the Ludovico Technique. When Alex is conditioned against violence, he is also conditioned against Beethoven. The state does not merely remove his capacity for evil, it mutilates his capacity for aesthetic experience. Burgess sees this as a violation of the human soul, because Alex's freedom to choose evil was inseparable from his freedom to experience beauty. Kubrick, by contrast, makes the loss feel colder and more mechanical. Music is no longer simply Alex's private ecstasy. It becomes another instrument used upon him, another mechanism in the larger machinery of control. After the introductory sequence in the film, the plot unfolds in a comparable manner, with some key exceptions. Chiefly, there is much more ultraviolence in the book, and several scenes from the film were altered accordingly. Instead of the Droogs mercilessly beating an old drunkard in the first instance of this ultraviolence in the film, Burgess's version has the characters first beat up a bookworm, then assault a shopkeeper and his wife, robbing them. Pragmatically, and distinct from the movie as well, Alex and his cronies can plead innocence for such events by gaining the trust of a group of senior citizens at a local bar, buying them drinks in exchange for an alibi. The gang thieves a car and drives to a local village, making a pit stop to pester and punish two lovers with their fists. The film and book converge when they arrive at a cottage called home, the household of a writer and his wife. After tricking the wife into letting them in, the group viciously attacks both residents and rapes the wife in front of the writer. A key difference here is how Alex observes his surroundings. An action that appears in the novella and not in the cinematic version is that the main vulgarian stumbles upon a work of the writer, titled The Clockwork Orange. The excerpt provided hones in on a key theme of both mediums, namely free will. Following the ferocious night of ruthlessness, the novel and film line up for a time. Alex skips school, citing a pain in the Gulliver, and is eventually visited by his post-corrective advisor, who appears far more sinister in the film. The tenacious teen then heads to the record shop, purchasing a copy of Ludwig van's Ninth Symphony. Again, the film and novel diverge. In Burgess's magnum opus, Alex's eyes become fixated on a pair of 10-year-old preteen girls, proceeding to liquor them up at his home and then raping them. In Kubrick's work, Alex actually charms two women of his age, and he brings them back to his establishment for a consensual day of lovemaking. Both continue in a similar fashion until Alex is inevitably betrayed by his droogs and sent to prison for murdering a cat lady. Notably, this is where Kubrick and Burgess's objectives of expression seem to explicitly contrast. Kubrick situates Alex DeLarge, now 655321, as being fastidiously searched bodily for objects, a rigid procedural detail that is completely absent from the book. Kubrick, by depicting a prison guard through a thoroughly auto-totalitarian lens, shifts the film's focus to the prison institution itself. Alex's prison narrative unfolds through his malicious misinterpretation of the Bible, such as fantasizing about being a Roman legionary torturing Jesus, and making the friendship of a priest. Same in both accounts, but book Alex's condition in the clink shifts to the presence of overcrowding, so much so that his cell, already populated by 4 felons, must take in a 5th. In response to this, Alex's cellmates strike the man near to death, and DeLarge finishes the job with a toll chalk to the Gulliver. The Ludovico Technique next falls into Alex's hands, with the film showing him as chosen for speaking up in the presence of the Minister of the Interior, while book Alex is conscripted for that aforementioned murder. Treatment manifests itself in essentially the same forms in the book and the film, with Alex pricked with a serum and exposed to disturbing films. Once Alex is reintegrated into society after a fortnight, the story unfolds as he is alienated from his home by a lodger. After leaving his former home in shame, Alex is assaulted in different forms by some of his past victims, then ostensibly rescued by his former droog Dim and his former rival Billy Boy, now police officers, where they eventually have their fun with him. A slight distinction is that in the film, it is not Dim and Billy Boy, but Dim and Georgie. Alex, in a dilapidated state, slowly mobilizes towards the cottage home for safety, where he is eventually discovered to be the culprit of the writer's late wife, albeit in distinct fashions. The writer in the novel realizes Alex's identity through his Nadsat slang. In Kubrick's piece, Alex sings Singin' in the Rain while triumphantly bathing, inducing the writer into an egregious epiphany. He is then drugged, taken to a third-party location, and trapped in a room. A classical composition by Ludwig van Alex once adored, now made horribly intolerable by the treatment, begins to seep deep into his eardrums. Vengefully playing the melody below is the writer as Alex jumps from above through a window to escape his tormented existence. While sustaining incredible injuries, little Alex does not perish from his fall. Instead, he awakens in a hospital bed and begins to regress once more into the aestheticization of violence. This is the moment when the novel and film initially converge, but their philosophical destinations begin to diverge. In both mediums, Alex's attempted suicide shatters the Ludovico conditioning and returns him to some form of choice. Yet what each artist does with that recovered choice is radically different. Burgess uses it as the beginning of a final movement toward maturity. Kubrick uses it as the final confirmation of preservation. The state, having failed to morally reform Alex, now uses him for political repair. The Minister of the Interior, or rather the Minister of the Inferior, does not restore Alex's humanity so much as restore the government's public image. Alex is fed, photographed, flattered, and symbolically repaired by the same institutional force that previously stripped him of choice. This is why the term cure becomes so grotesquely ironic. The government never cures Alex of evil, nor does it care to. It only cures the scandal attached to its own mechanism of control. Alex's body becomes a public relations instrument, a living correction to the state's earlier failure. This is where Kubrick's conclusion becomes so bleak, but also so seductive. The final image is not one of maturity, confession, or moral recognition, but of preservation. Alex imagines himself once again surrounded by spectacle, appetite, and sexual triumph, while a formally dressed crowd applauds as if civilization itself has accepted his return. The image is obscene, but also elegant, repulsive, but also strangely exhilarating. When Alex says, "I was cured all right," the line works as a brutal irony. He is cured only in the sense that he has been returned to his original capacity for evil. The state has not made him good. It has merely made him useful. Dan Shaw's reading of Kubrick is helpful here because it complicates the temptation to view the ending as mere nihilism. In Shaw's account, Kubrick is not merely celebrating Alex's cruelty. He is celebrating the restoration of choice, even when that choice may lead back to depravity. This is the film's trap. Alex's freedom is horrifying, but the removal of that freedom is even more petrifying. A world with Alex's evil is monstrous, but a state capable of manufacturing goodness through coercion is perhaps more monstrous still. Kubrick's final sequence, therefore, leaves us in a deeply uncomfortable position. We are relieved that Alex is human again, yet repulsed by what his humanity entails. Burgess's novel, however, refuses to leave Alex completely frozen in this condition. In the final chapter, Alex begins to grow tired of ultraviolence. He is no longer the same adolescent creature who once treated violence as music, sport, and spiritual release. He forms a new gang, but the old rituals feel hollow. His violent appetites have not been morally defeated by the state. They have simply begun to exhaust themselves. This distinction is crucial. Burgess does not suggest that Alex has been purified. Rather, he suggests that Alex may be aging out of the performance that once defined him. The encounter with Pete compels this contrast to go even further. Pete, once one of Alex's droogs, has become married, settled, and domesticated. To Alex, this is initially strange, almost pathetic. It soon becomes quietly revelatory. Pete represents a life beyond the adolescent economy of dominance, spectacle, and nightly violence. He is not heroic, but he has crossed into another stage of existence. Through Pete, Alex begins to imagine a future that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the narrative. A wife, a child, and a life no longer governed by the same repetitive cravings. Burgess's conclusion is not sentimental redemption, but biological and spiritual fatigue. Evil in Alex is not conquered in a grand moral epiphany. It is outgrown. This is also why Burgess's conclusion feels more literary than cinematic. The novel can afford to let Alex turn inward, to allow his narration to soften, hesitate, and become less intoxicated with its own violence. His change occurs through reflection. Kubrick's film, by contrast, concludes through image and sound, Beethoven, hospital whiteness, stage political reconciliation, erotic fantasy, and applause. Burgess ends with a mind slowly altering its relation to the world. Kubrick ends with an image restoring itself. One medium closes through introspection, the other closes through spectacle. The contrast becomes even clearer when considering Alex's selfhood. Riswita Sarma argues that Burgess's novel follows Alex's search for selfhood within a dystopian society that repeatedly reduces him to an instrument of the state. This is central to the ending. In the novel, Alex's final movement toward maturity is a return to selfhood. He is not merely recovering the ability to choose violence, he is beginning to wonder what else choice might be for. His question is no longer only, what's it gonna be then, in the sense of nightly appetite. It becomes a larger existential query. What kind of life is possible after violence has lost its charm? Kubrick does not grant Alex that same inward development. His Alex remains visually and morally preserved. The boulder-headed demon of the opening shot survives into the final fantasy, even if the setting has shifted from the Korova milk bar to the hospital room. This is why Kubrick's ending feels circular. Alex is returned to the beginning, but now with the implicit protection of the establishment. He is not merely a delinquent anymore. He is a delinquent absorbed in politics, publicity, and power. The state has not defeated violence, it has recruited it. This also transforms the meaning of classical music. In Burgess, Beethoven is tied to Alex's private aesthetic sensitivity, one of the contradictions that makes him more than a mere machine. His love of music implies that beauty still reaches him. even if he fuses that beauty with sadistic fantasy. In Kubrick, Beethoven becomes part of the final spectacle of restoration. The Ode to Joy does not signal moral uplift in any simple sense. It becomes the sound of Alex's recovered appetite, the anthem of a soul returned to its old pleasures. What is joyous for Alex is terrifying for everyone else. Thus, the conflict between Burgess and Kubrick is not merely a conflict of endings, but a conflict of moral imagination. Burgess sees Alex as a creature capable of eventual change, not through conditioning, not through state violence, and not through institutional correction, but through the slow and mysterious exhaustion of youth. Kubrick, by contrast, preserves Alex as an image, grinning, theatrical, violent, and unchanged. Burgess's Alex may one day become a man. Kubrick's Alex remains a clockwork boy, wound back into motion, smiling as the machine begins again. In this sense, A Clockwork Orange becomes two different works wearing the same title. One is a story about moral choice, maturation, and the possibility that even the most corrupted youth may eventually outgrow his own depravity. The other is a colder version of circularity, in which institutions are corrupt, violence is seductive, and Alex's soul remains untouched by consequences. Burgess concludes with maturity. Kubrick concludes with preservation. And between those two conclusions lies the enduring conflict of A Clockwork Orange. Personally speaking, I enjoy both models alike, but I will say that Kubrick's movie takes the edge for me, not only in comparison to Burgess's book, but it has situated itself as one of my favorite films of all time. One of the main reasons the movie feels fantastical to me is the sheer absurdity on display. Sure, the novella generally chronicles the same narrative, but it's far more disturbing, shocking, and comical on the big screen. Furthermore, the movie served as a gateway to imagining how the setting develops while reading. And while many proclaim that it is preferred for one to read before watching, I genuinely think it deserves a better purpose for one to watch before reading, in this case, as the moving picture allows for the viewer to actually fully characterize the sadism and vile nature of Alex DeLarge, as well as the insidious institutions that surround him. Moreover, Kubrick's interpretation permits Burgess's world to be more dystopian and idiosyncratic than one may picture from the novel alone. Lastly, the score used is absolutely magnificent. This again allows the consumer to comprehend the necessary themes conveyed. In this instance, the sheer irony of a monster like Alex having such taste in the sublime arts while at the same time committing his life to such odious and sordid practices. What ultimately separates the feature from the novella is the conclusion. This is where the movie puts itself above the novel. The reason Burgess's ending is not as compelling is that it is so spontaneous. The narrative itself never points readers in this direction. And Alex doesn't even have the slightest shame, remorse, or second thought about what he is doing to others throughout any of the book. While this ending can be perceived as the culmination of the story's free will shtick, and that is all well and true, it just feels so rushed, and actually exhausts the book into an anticlimactic direction, as the themes are already so poignant and profound themselves. The final irony is what makes the film endure for me. "I was cured all right" is not just a punchline. It is the whole nightmare condensed into one sentence. Alex has regained his freedom, but that freedom leads him right back into appetite, spectacle, and violence. Burgess concludes with the possibility that Alex may one day become a man. Kubrick concludes with the certainty that Alex remains a clockwork boy, wound back into motion and applauded by the very society that claims to have cured him. For that reason, the film's ending feels cooler, crueler, and finally more unforgettable.